October 332 BC, Gaza. Imagine standing on top of a desert fortress, 60 feet above the sand, higher than a 6-story building. Anyone who dares to climb toward you will face a storm of arrows, stones, and fire. You look down at the army gathering below, and you ask yourself one question. How could anyone possibly drag machines weighing tons up that slope? Let him come. This mound will kill him for us. The gates of Gaza slam shut. The granaries are full, the boulders are stacked, the spears are sharpened. Before any army can even touch this wall, it has to defeat the hill first. Here is what should terrify you about this story. It is not about a wall. It is about the exact same mistake that is happening right now, in 2026, in businesses, in marriages, in bank accounts. The mistake of believing that height or money or reputation or 30 years of success makes you untouchable. Stay with me for the next 40 minutes because I'm going to walk you through 9 moments, 9 decisions that turned an unbreakable fortress into rubble. Point 4 is the moment where confidence turns into blindness, and it is the single most common reason things collapse, whether it's a 2,000-year-old city or your own retirement plan. Point 7 is the moment that will change how you look at impossible odds forever. And at the very end, I'm going to hand you one free simple tool that shows you exactly how to spot this same pattern before it destroys something you've built. Don't skip ahead. This only makes sense in order. Point 1. The war was never really about the city in front of you. To understand Gaza, you have to understand what Alexander actually wanted. It wasn't Gaza, it was Egypt. Egypt controlled the grain, the ports, and roughly 1/3 of the wealth flowing through the eastern Mediterranean at that time. If Alexander took Egypt, the Persian king Darius III would lose one of his richest possessions, permanently. So Alexander marched south along the coast of Palestine, and city after city opened its gates without a fight. They had watched what happened at Tyre months earlier, a siege so brutal that word of it traveled faster than the army itself. Most governors did the math and surrendered. But here's the important part. This is where it gets personal. Think of a small business owner watching every competitor around them fold or sell out during a downturn, one after another, while they alone decide to stay open, dig in, and fight. That is exactly the position Gaza's governor, a man named Batis, found himself in. Every neighboring city had made the smart, safe choice. Batis made the opposite one. He kept the gates closed. Not a coincidence. A decision. Gaza sat directly on the only road into Egypt. If Alexander marched past it, Gaza would remain a hostile, fully stocked fortress sitting behind his army, able to cut his supply lines, kill his messengers, and ambush stragglers for months. Batis knew this. He knew Alexander could not simply walk away. He had Arab mercenaries reinforce the walls. He stockpiled food for a long siege. He was not hiding. He was waiting. With a plan. But the thing that made Gaza different from every city before it wasn't the walls. It was the ground beneath them. Point 2. The advantage everyone could see was the one that mattered least. When the Macedonian army arrived, the real problem became visible for the first time. Gaza wasn't just walled. It stood on a raised mound, over 60 feet above the surrounding desert, at the very edge of the sand where the main trade road from Assyria to Egypt cut through. From below, Macedonian soldiers had to physically tilt their heads back just to see the top of the battlements. On open ground, Alexander was unbeatable. His cavalry could sweep across a field faster than any army in the ancient world could react. Gaza took that weapon away from him completely. Height, not numbers, was Batis's real defense. A soldier could see an approaching force from a mile off. Officers below couldn't hide a single movement. Every step forward was made in full view, under fire, uphill. I know what you're thinking right now, so he just needed more men. That's the mistake almost everyone makes when they hear this story. Alexander didn't have a manpower problem at Gaza. He had a geometry problem. And you cannot solve geometry with force. You solve it with patience, or you lose. Slow down. Don't scroll past this. Read that sentence again. You cannot solve a structural problem by pushing harder. That single idea is the entire reason this siege took 2 months instead of 2 days. And it is the same reason most people's biggest problems in their own lives never get solved. They keep pushing harder at the wrong spot instead of changing where they're pushing. Point 3. The first plan almost destroyed the very machines meant to win the war. Alexander chose the southern wall, not because it was weak, but because, compared to the rest of Gaza, it was the least impossible. He ordered two things to happen at once. First, in total secrecy, his engineers began digging a tunnel toward the wall's foundation, far from where Gaza's watchmen could see it. Second, in plain sight, his men rolled massive wooden siege towers toward the southern approach, loud, visible, impossible to ignore. This was deception built entirely out of construction. While Batis's men watched the towers with growing dread, the real danger crept forward silently underground. But then the desert itself fought back. The ground beneath the towers was loose sand, not solid earth, and the machines began sinking under their own weight. Ropes tore into soldiers' hands. Wooden frames cracked. A tower meant to carry men safely to the wall instead became a trap, twisting and groaning, stuck fast in the sand while archers on the walls above took aim at the men frozen beneath it. By late afternoon, Alexander called off the assault. Not from fear, from arithmetic. Losing the machines now meant losing the entire siege later. Batis, watching from above, saw something he'd been praying for: hesitation. Here's an objection I know some of you have right now. If Alexander was such a genius, why did his first plan just fail? Because genius in siege warfare was never about having a plan that couldn't fail. It was about having the discipline to stop the moment a plan starts bleeding you dry, before pride convinces you to keep throwing men at a mistake. That single trait, the willingness to stop and rebuild instead of doubling down, is point 4, and it's the one that separates the people who eventually win from the people who go broke or go under, still convinced they were almost there. Bridge. What happened that same night involved a crow, a warning, and a wound that would follow Alexander for the rest of his life. And it's the moment this siege stopped being a story about engineering and became a story about pride. Before resuming the attack, Alexander performed a sacrifice, as commanders of his era always did before major decisions. During the ritual, a crow flew overhead and dropped a piece of dry mud directly onto his head, then landed on one of the stalled siege towers. His seer, a man named Aristander, studied the omen and delivered a warning that spread through the camp within the hour. Gaza would fall, but Alexander himself would be wounded before it did. Stop for a second and sit with that. An army of tens of thousands of men, about to storm one of the most defended positions in the ancient world, just heard their own king had been told he would bleed for this city. Fear moves through soldiers exactly the way it moves through a family that just found out bad news is coming. Nobody knows when, only that it's certain. Alexander held back the main assault that day. Batis, from the walls, read the pause as weakness. And what he did next, a sudden, violent gamble that would put Alexander's own life on the line in the dust below Gaza's walls, is exactly where we're going next. Don't go anywhere. The next part is where this stops being a siege and starts being personal. From the walls of Gaza, Batis watched Alexander hold back his men after the Omen, and he made a decision that would define the rest of this war. He saw hesitation. He saw exhausted workers still tangled in rope beside broken siege towers. He saw an army that, for one afternoon, looked beatable. So the gates of Gaza opened. Arab mercenaries came pouring out, not to fight the whole Macedonian army. That would have been suicide against a force many times larger. They came for one target only, the siege engines. If those towers burned, weeks of labor would turn to ash in minutes. If the workers scattered in panic, Batis could seize back control of the entire siege. Picture it the way you'd picture a burglary, not a battle. A small, fast team moving with total purpose, straight toward the one thing that actually mattered. Men who had been hauling rope grabbed for shields instead. The fighting exploded around the stalled machines in a storm of dust and shouting. This is where the story stops being about walls and starts being about one man's choice. Alexander did not send a general to handle it. He rode into the fighting himself, with his companions and his elite guard beside him, the Hypaspists, roughly 3,000 of Macedonia's most trusted soldiers. The mercenaries who had expected to burn wood and terrify frightened laborers instead found themselves facing the king of Macedon, in the dust, at arm's length. Slow down here, don't scroll past this next part. According to the ancient historian Quintus Curtius Rufus, one of Batis's men dropped to his knees in front of Alexander as if begging for surrender, close enough to be within a sword's reach. It was a trick. In one motion, the man lunged for Alexander's neck. Alexander twisted away just enough to avoid the killing blow. Almost the same instant, an arrow tore into his shoulder. Sit with that for a second. The most powerful conqueror in the ancient world, a man who would go on to build an empire stretching from Greece to India, nearly died in the sand outside a mid-sized fortified town most people today have never heard of, because he refused to watch from a distance while his men bled. The omen from the night before had been right. He had been warned. He went anyway. The defenders pulled back into the city with something they hadn't had in weeks. Proof. Proof that resistance drew real blood, that the invincible king could be hurt like anyone else. From the walls, some soldiers likely believed Alexander had been badly wounded, maybe even fatally. For one evening, Gaza allowed itself to believe it might actually win. I know what some of you are thinking right now. So, pride almost got him killed, and the lesson here is, don't be reckless. That's not quite it, and this is the part that gets missed every time this story gets told. Alexander's wound didn't happen because he was reckless. It happened because he had already decided, long before this siege, that he would never ask his men to bleed for something he wasn't willing to bleed for himself. That decision built an empire. It also nearly ended his life at Gaza, and it would nearly kill him again years later in India. The line between the trait that makes you unstoppable and the trait that gets you hurt is thinner than almost anyone wants to admit. In war, in business, in your own life. That is point 5, and it's the one people don't want to hear, because it means there's no clean answer. Courage and recklessness often look identical from the outside. Point 6. The wound didn't end the war. It changed the entire strategy. Here's what almost nobody expects about what happened next. Alexander didn't retreat. He didn't send reinforcements to try the same tunnel and tower plan again, harder. He looked at what had actually gone wrong. Sand that swallowed his machines, height that gave Gaza eyes on every move he made. And he made a decision that must have sounded almost insane to his own officers. He decided to build a second mountain. Not attack the mound Gaza stood on. Build a new one, from scratch, right next to it, tall enough and wide enough to carry his heaviest siege engines level with the walls Gaza had trusted for years. Think about the scale of that decision for a moment, because it's easy to read past it. This wasn't a ramp made in an afternoon. Ancient sources describe a platform that eventually reached over 250 feet wide and by some accounts close to 200 feet high in places, built entirely by hand, basket by basket, by soldiers who had marched thousands of miles through Asia and were now, suddenly, construction laborers in the desert heat. Here's the bridge you need before we go further. This is the moment the entire siege changed from a war of speed into a war of patience. And patience is the one weapon almost nobody expects from a 24-year-old king known for moving faster than any army in history. Every single day, for weeks, Batis watched this mound grow from the walls of Gaza. Imagine the psychological weight of that. It's one thing to lose a battle in an afternoon. It's another thing entirely to watch, day after day, as the exact advantage that has protected your home for your entire life, the height, the impossible slope, the thing that made your walls unreachable, gets slowly, deliberately erased in front of you, and there is nothing you can do to stop it. This is the same dread a homeowner feels watching a wildfire creep closer for days instead of arriving in one night. The slow version of danger is often more terrifying than the fast one, because you have time to imagine every possible ending. I know what you might be thinking. Why didn't Batis just attack the mound while it was being built? He tried. Ancient accounts describe raids and skirmishes during construction, arrows fired down at the workers, attempts to slow the progress. But Alexander protected the work with the same discipline he protected everything else, soldiers screening the laborers, engines guarding the flanks. Batis could slow the mound, he could not stop it. And a slowed inevitability is still an inevitability. That is the trap Gaza found itself in, and it is a trap that shows up constantly in real life. When you can only delay a problem instead of solving it, the outcome doesn't change, only the date does. Bridge to what's coming. Once that mound reached the height Alexander needed, everything Gaza had relied on for generations became worthless in a single afternoon. Stone throwers were dragged up the new slope. The walls that had looked down on Macedonia for 2 months now sat eye level with Alexander's heaviest weapons. And that is where the real bombardment, the one that finally cracked Gaza open, begins. Stay with me. This next part is where the walls actually start to fail, and where you'll see exactly why the thing that protected you yesterday can become the exact thing that destroys you tomorrow if you never plan for it to be taken away. Point 7. When the thing that protects you becomes the thing that destroys you. This is the point that changes how you think about safety forever. Not later, right now, while you're reading this. For generations, Gaza's height had been its salvation. Every enemy before Alexander had looked up at that 60-foot mound and decided the cost of climbing it wasn't worth the fight. That single geographic fact had kept Gaza safe for longer than anyone in the city could remember. Height was Gaza's entire identity. It wasn't just a defense, it was a belief so deep that Batis staked the lives of everyone inside those walls on it. And then, over the course of a few weeks, that belief became a lie. Once Alexander's new mound reached the necessary height, his engineers dragged the heaviest stone throwers in the Macedonian arsenal up the slope. For the first time in the entire siege, Macedonian weapons stood level with Gaza's battlements, instead of hundreds of feet below them. The exact same walls that had made Batis feel untouchable now stood exposed, at eye level, to sustained, aimed bombardment. Slow down. Don't skip this. This is the whole point of the story. The thing that protects you only protects you as long as the conditions around it stay the same. The moment those conditions shift, the moment someone finds a way to erase your advantage instead of confronting it head-on, the protection doesn't weaken slowly, it disappears completely, almost overnight, and the people relying on it are often the last to notice because they've stopped questioning whether it still works. Think of the retired couple who put every dollar of their savings into one investment 30 years ago because it always went up. Think of the family business that never updated how it reached customers because people have always found us this way. The mechanism is identical to Gaza. Confidence built on a static advantage in a world that never stays static. Point 8. The wall didn't fall all at once. It failed the way trust fails, slowly, then suddenly. When the bombardment began, it did not look like victory. Stones from Alexander's engines struck the southern wall again and again, throwing dust and broken fragments across the battlements. Soldiers pulled back from the most exposed sections. Officers inside Gaza screamed commands that could barely be heard over the impacts. For the first few days, the wall held. That's important. Gaza didn't collapse from the very first strike. It absorbed damage again and again, the way a foundation absorbs cracks long before a building actually falls. Batis rushed men to the damaged sections between bombardments. Workers packed rubble into the gaps. For a while, it looked almost like the defense might hold, repair matching pace with destruction. Then it stopped matching pace. One section, weakened past its limit, finally gave way. Not with a single dramatic strike, but the way a dam fails, one crack widening under pressure it had already been carrying for days. Stone loosened, dust thickened into a wall of its own, and through that opening, for the first time in the entire siege, Alexander's men could see straight into the city. Here's an objection I know some of you are having right now. If the wall was already cracking for days, why didn't Batis just evacuate the weak point or negotiate? Because admitting the wall was truly failing would have meant admitting that everything Gaza had staked its survival on, the height, the preparation, the 2 months of resistance, the wound that had drawn Alexander's own blood, had bought them time, but never actually changed the outcome. That is an almost impossible thing for anyone to admit while there's still a wall standing, even a cracked one. People don't abandon a losing position because the position is lost. They abandon it when they can no longer pretend it isn't. By the time Batis could no longer pretend, the breach was already forming. Bridge. This is the exact moment where 2 months of patience, tunnels, mounds, and bombardment finally turned into something Gaza could not survive: a door. Alexander did not celebrate the breach. He understood, from Tyre and from every siege before it, that an opening in a wall is not a victory. It is an invitation into the most dangerous fighting of the entire campaign. Close, chaotic, house-to-house combat, where numbers matter less than nerve. He gathered his best troops near the breach, the Hypaspists, the same elite guard who had pulled him back from the mercenaries' blade weeks earlier. The bombardment engines kept firing, not to widen the hole further, but to keep Gaza's defenders pinned down, exhausted, unable to organize a real counterline. When the signal came, the assault moved through the dust. Now stop scrolling for a moment, because what happens in the next few minutes of this siege is the part almost no documentary tells you honestly. Batis's men rushed to meet the Macedonians directly at the shattered stone, understanding, correctly, that this breach was Gaza's very last chance. If it held for even a few more hours, exhaustion might force Alexander to pull back again, the way he had after the failed tower assault weeks earlier. If it failed, there would be no walls left between the Macedonian army and everyone still alive inside the city. There was no room here for the kind of warfare Alexander had built his reputation on. No sweeping cavalry charges, no elegant tactical maneuvers. This was men pressed shoulder to shoulder in rubble and dust, spears jabbing through gaps where visibility was nearly zero, shields locking against shields in a space barely wide enough for a handful of soldiers to stand. Then more Macedonians reached the breach from behind the first wave, and that changed everything. The mathematics of a breach are brutal and simple. Whoever can keep feeding fresh soldiers into the gap eventually wins it, because exhaustion decides these fights more than skill does. Gaza had roughly 2 months of stored food, but Batis's garrison did not have unlimited reserves of energy, morale, or replacement fighters. Alexander, on the other side of that opening, commanded an army numbering in the tens of thousands. The gap between those two realities is where Gaza's fate was actually decided, not at the moment the wall cracked, but in the minutes after, when one side simply had more left to give than the other. The fighting spilled past the breach and into the streets themselves, and once that happened, the single advantage that had defined this entire siege, height, stopped mattering completely. Alleys, doorways, rooftops, courtyards, none of it cared how tall Gaza's walls used to be. This is where the story stops being about a fortress. In the next part, I'll show you exactly what happened once the fighting moved inside the city, and why what Alexander did afterward is still debated by historians as one of the most brutal moments of his entire career. Stay with me. This next part is where the real cost of Gaza's 2-month resistance finally comes due, and it's not the part of this story that gets told in the highlight reels. Once the fighting spilled past the breach and into the streets, Gaza stopped being one fortress and became something far more dangerous for the people inside it. Dozens of small, scattered, disconnected fights, each one slowly losing. Height had been Gaza's entire strategy for 2 months. Inside the city, it meant nothing. Alleys favored whoever knew them best. Doorways became choke points. Rooftops turned into sniper positions for a few desperate minutes before they too were overrun. Batis's soldiers fought in pockets, cut off from each other by advancing Macedonian troops, unable to reform into anything resembling the disciplined defense that had held for 2 full months. Some groups fell back toward inner positions, already crowded with refugees who had nowhere left to run. Others held narrow passages until they were simply surrounded and finished. The sound of organized battle, commands, formations, coordinated resistance, dissolved into something closer to survival. Dust and smoke filled streets that had felt, only weeks earlier, completely untouchable. Stop here for a second. This is the part of the story that gets rushed past in most retellings, and it's the part that actually matters most if you want to understand why this pattern repeats throughout history. The wall falling was not the disaster. The wall falling was the moment the disaster became unavoidable. Everything that happened after, The loss of coordination, the isolation of small groups, the collapse of morale happened because there was no plan for what came after the thing everyone had trusted stopped working. Gaza had a brilliant plan for defending its walls. It had almost no plan for defending itself once the walls were gone. That gap between planning for the expected threat and planning for the moment your main defense fails is the single most common reason collapses turn total instead of partial. A business with one client generating most of its revenue. A retirement plan built around one pension that later gets cut. A family relying on one income during a layoff. The wall is different every time. The absence of a plan for after the wall falls is always the same. When the last pockets of resistance finally gave out, Gaza fell. The aftermath was brutal, even by the standards of ancient warfare. According to the historical sources, Arrian and Quintus Curtius Rufus among them, the city was looted, its male population killed, and its women and children taken as captives. For Gaza, the choice to resist when every neighboring city had already surrendered ended in near total destruction. I know this is hard to sit with, and I know some of you are thinking, then why does anyone call this a victory if the cost was this high on both sides? Because history rarely measures a siege by whether it was worth it. It measures it by who was left standing at the end, and what road opened up because of it. That's an uncomfortable truth, but it's the truth this entire campaign was built on. Then came Batis himself. The commander who had trusted height, preparation, and 2 months of stubborn resistance now stood in front of the man he had wounded, delayed, and defied. According to Curtius Rufus, Batis refused to kneel. Even facing total defeat, he met Alexander with silence. No plea, no negotiation, nothing that resembled surrender even in his final moments. That silence, according to the ancient accounts, is what turned Alexander's victory into something darker. He ordered Batis tied to a chariot and dragged around the city, an act ancient historians themselves recorded with visible discomfort, a moment where the same king remembered for extraordinary tactical patience showed an equally extraordinary capacity for cruelty when his pride had already been wounded once, in the dust, weeks earlier. This is the part of Alexander's story that documentaries love to skip, and it's worth sitting with for a moment instead of scrolling past it. The same trait that built the Mound, that waited weeks instead of throwing men at broken machines, that showed real strategic patience, that trait had a shadow side. Once his pride was wounded, patience gave way to something much less rational. Greatness and cruelty, in Alexander's case, were not opposites. They came from the exact same source, a refusal to accept that anyone could defy him and walk away undamaged. That's an uncomfortable thing to learn about one of history's most celebrated commanders, but leaving it out doesn't make it less true. Here's where the story turns, because the road wasn't done. Egypt was still waiting. With Gaza finally gone, the strategic problem Alexander had faced for 2 months simply disappeared. No hostile garrison behind his army, no fortress able to threaten his supply lines while he pushed toward the Nile. The road south, for the first time since he'd left the coast, was completely open. And here is the twist almost nobody expects, the part of this story that flips everything you just watched on its head. When Alexander's army finally reached Egypt, they were met with something completely different from Gaza. No closed gates, no 2-month siege, no mound built by hand under enemy fire. Egyptians, who had spent generations resenting Persian rule, welcomed Alexander as a liberator. Cities opened their doors willingly. There was no bombardment, no breach, no house-to-house fighting through smoke-filled streets. Sit with that contrast for a moment, because it's the real lesson buried underneath 2 months of siege warfare. Gaza fought with everything it had: courage, preparation, a commander who refused to surrender even facing death, and it was destroyed. Egypt offered no resistance at all, and it became one of the most valuable territories Alexander would ever control, the place where he would later found the city that still bears his name today, Alexandria. I know what some of you are thinking right now. So resistance was pointless. Gaza should have just surrendered like everyone else. That's the tempting conclusion, but it's not quite the right one, and here's why it matters. Gaza's resistance wasn't pointless because it failed to stop Alexander. It mattered because of what it revealed, about strategy, about the limits of geography as a defense, about what happens to any position, city, or plan the moment its one key advantage gets neutralized instead of confronted head-on. The lesson was never, don't resist. The lesson was, don't build your entire survival around one advantage you assume can never be taken away. That is the exact same lesson playing out today in situations that look nothing like a desert fortress on the surface, but follow the identical underlying pattern. A skill that used to guarantee job security until it didn't. A market position that used to guarantee customers until competitors found a way around it. A financial strategy that used to guarantee stability until conditions shifted and nobody had planned for the shift. Here's the bridge to what's coming next, and it's the part of this video that matters most for you personally, not just historically. Alexander won at Gaza not because he was stronger. He had roughly the same size problem the whole time, a city he could not reach by force alone. He won because the moment his first plan failed, he didn't repeat it harder. He rebuilt the entire approach from the ground up, literally, one basket of earth at a time, until the advantage that had protected Gaza for generations simply ceased to exist. That is the exact mental shift most people never make when they hit their own version of an unreachable wall. Whether that wall is a financial goal that never seems to move, a health problem that resists every quick fix, or a plan that keeps failing the same way for the same reason. Pushing harder at the same broken approach is Alexander's failed tower assault. Rebuilding the ground itself is the mound, and that's exactly where I want to go next, because there is a free, simple way to check whether you're currently pushing at a broken tower or building a real mound in whatever situation in your own life feels unreachable right now. Stay with me. This next part is the most useful part of this entire video.